Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Paula in the Great Northwest. Where'd it go? In the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Ryan in Florida, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, and Sai, the Talmud cat, is in the house too. Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Marie saying Shalom Salanina. Welcome everybody. Great to be with you. Our daf today is page 110 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We are completing our discussion of Mishna number 6, God willing, here in chapter 9, opening the final Mishna, pretty sure, Mishna number 7 here in chapter 9. So we've been talking about this somebody who robs, swears falsely about it, repents, needs to make restitution, pay the fifth, bring a guilt offering. If the one he robbed was a convert, and the reason a convert matters is because he left no heirs. So then, who are we gonna make restitution to? There are no heirs that the restitution could be made to them. So in that situation, you give it to the priests when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. And now that we're talking about priests and receiving these donations, receiving priestly gifts, we get into some interesting nuances of that law and that area of the law. So the Gemara, near the bottom of page 109b, records another baraisa, right? So for those who are new, a baraisa is a teaching that is not quite as authoritative as a Mishnah, but of the same time period, right? So what we're learning here in the Talmud is the oral law, the oral tradition, also known as the oral Torah. So at Mount Sinai, when God appeared to the whole Jewish people, 2 million people witnessed the revelation at Mount Sinai. Some say 3 million people. And God spoke personally, God's voice spoke the first 2 commandments. The people were then just couldn't handle it anymore. They thought their souls would fly out of their bodies. So God dictated the rest of the commandments, not just the rest of the 10 commandments, but all the commandments to Moses. Moses was like God's secretary, wrote it all down, and that was the written Torah. And at the same time, some core teachings and the core principles of the oral Torah were given. And so it is the oral Torah and the written Torah together that really constitute the Torah. And the oral Torah was meant to remain an oral tradition taught from teacher to student in every generation, and this would enable the rabbis or the elders, let's say in any generation, to answer questions that could never have been anticipated in earlier generations because the world kept changing. And then the oral tradition was, like I said, meant to remain an oral tradition. But there were times in Jewish history where the persecution of the Jews, something we understand sadly better now since 10:7, where the persecution of the Jews became so intense, especially a Roman persecution around the year, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135 of the Common Era, it got worse and worse and worse and worse, and they were afraid that the caretakers of the oral tradition, the elders of the generation, the rabbis of the generation, the sages, would all be killed, and the oral tradition would be lost. And that's why it was first written down. And that was the Mishnah. So there were already Mishnas, right, individual laws that had been sort of added, or, some were given by God at Mount Sinai. There are teachings that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai, meant to be oral traditions, not written. And others were added over the centuries, rabbinic decrees, rabbinic interpretations of laws in the Torah. And then the most authoritative of those were known as Mishnayos. And then they were set down in a compilation called the Mishna around the year 200. And then some of the laws and teachings that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but were of the same period and nearly as authoritative, are known as baraisas. And then over the next 300 years, commentary editing was done on the Mishnah until that next layer of commentary was set down around the year 500. And that is known as the Gemara, that first layer of commentary on the Mishnah. And together, the Gemara and the Mishnah are the Talmud. But the Talmud is never static. It is an ever-flowing fountain of wisdom. And so over the centuries since, more and more layers of commentary have been added to it. And that's why the Talmud is so vast. So just a quick introduction to what is the Talmud. Okay, so the Gemara records another baraisa concerning the rights of a priest to offerings that he sacrifices, right? So when the temple is standing in Jerusalem and people bring sacrifices, whether they're communal sacrifices brought on behalf of the Jewish nation, and there's some sacrifices that are brought on behalf of all the nations of the world, or individual sacrifices that are brought. Some sacrifices are known as an olah, an elevation offering that is consumed entirely upon the altar. And then there are sin offerings where some of it goes up on the altar and some of it is eaten by the priest. And there are some parts of offerings, like the hides, that are given as a gift to the priests. So the priests, and most priests are not serving in the temple at any one time, but there would be a priestly watch, the group of priests serving during a particular week, and that priestly watch would receive certain gifts that were the parts meant for the priests of sacrifices that were brought during that period. So the sages taught from where is it derived that a priest may come and sacrifice his own offerings at any time and at any hour that he wishes, and does not have to wait for his priestly watch to serve in the temple, right? So there were known as these priestly watches. I think there were 24 of them. And they would serve this group of priests, right, for a week at a time, every 6 months. And then they would all be present during the big holidays when there were just so many thousands of individual offerings to be brought that it was like all hands on deck. But basically, any particular priest, now some priests never served in the temple, but the ones who did would normally serve for a week at a time, every 6 months, plus any service they did during big festivals. But if a priest had to bring his own offering, he was bringing a Thanksgiving offering or a sin offering or an elevation offering, whatever offering he was personally bringing for himself and his family. As a priest, he could enter the temple, and as long as he was in a state of purity and not having a physical blemish, he could bring his offering. And since it was his own offering, if there was a portion of that offering that went to the priests, right, that's the question. Does he keep it for himself? Does he share it with the priestly watch that's there then? Right? These are the kinds of questions being asked. So from where is it derived that, first of all, a priest may come and sacrifice his offerings at any time and at any hour that he wishes, and he does not have to wait for his particular priestly watch to have their week in the temple? How do we know this? The verse states, Deuteronomy 18, verses 6 and 7, "And if a Levite comes from any of your gates out of all of Israel, where he sojourns, and comes with all the desire of his soul unto the place that the Lord shall choose, then he shall minister in the name of the Lord his God." And the Baraisa continues, and from where is it derived that the performance of the offerings service, i.e. eating the meat of the animal that he sacrifices, and the offerings hide belong to him? Right? So the first was a proof that a priest could come and bring an offering, on behalf of himself, even if his particular priestly watch wasn't serving that week. And in terms of him being able to keep the portions that are for priests of his own offerings, how do we know this? Because the verse states, Numbers 5:10, and every man's hallowed things shall be his. So how so? If this priest was blemished, he gives his offering to another priest that is on the same priestly watch as him to sacrifice it, but the performance of its service and its hide belong to him. So now we're going to be making a distinction in this discussion between a priest who is disqualified from serving in the temple because he is blemished, meaning he has a physical blemish on his body, and priests could not bring an offering if they had certain kinds of physical blemishes, and a priest who is ritually impure. He is tamei. He has come into contact with a dead body, a corpse, or he came into contact with a dead creeping thing, a sheretz, or he came into contact with menstrual blood, or a woman who was menstruating. So in all these cases, he would need to go through the purification for that particular type of ritual impurity. And once he completed the purification, then he could, start working in the temple again as a priest. So on the one hand, disqualified because of a blemish, so he can't bring offerings on the altar, but he can enter the temple, he can enter the Temple Mount, and he can eat of the sacred things that are given to priests. If he's ritually impure, then he can't even enter the temple in that state of impurity. So not only can he not bring offerings, but he cannot eat of the sacrificial offerings, the portions that are designated for the priests. So now we're on page 110a, and the Baraisa continues, and if he was old or sick, so that he cannot perform the temple service or eat from the offering, once he reaches a certain age, no longer qualified to serve as a priest. So he gives it, in that case, he gives it to any priest that he wishes to sacrifice it, even to one who is not on his priestly watch. And the performance of its service and its hide are given to the members of the priestly watch. So the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of this priest who is old or sick? So if he is in a condition that he is able to perform the temple service, then performance of its service and its hide should be his, as well as the priest that sacrificed it was acting as his agent, right? So he can appoint another priest to bring an offering for him, as long as his disqualification is because, for example, here, if he's old or sick, so he's neither blemished nor impure. But because he's old or sick, he can't literally perform the service. So he can ask another priest to act as his agent, and it's like he gets the merit for that offering being brought, and he's able to eat the sacrificial portion that is designated for the priest. And if he is in a condition that he is not able to perform the temple service at all, then how can he appoint an agent? This Baraisa stated that he may give it to any priest he wishes, indicating that he chooses which priest he will appoint as his agent. So Rav Papa said the Baraisa is referring to a case where he is able to do it, but with difficulty. So that's why he can appoint an agent. If he's completely unable to do it, then he cannot appoint a fellow priest as his agent. So with regard to the temple service, where the law is that if he performs it with difficulty, it is still considered performance of the temple service, so he is therefore able to appoint an agent to do it for him. But with regard to eating the portions of sacrificial offerings designated for priests, where the law says that if he eats it with difficulty, it is considered excessive eating, known as achila gasa. And excessive eating, achila gasa, is nothing. I.e., he does not thereby fulfill the mitzvah to eat the sacrificial portion, and he is not able to appoint an agent to eat it for him. And due to that reason, performance of its service and its hide are given to members of the priestly watch. Now, this is fascinating. Excessive eating. Usually, this term, achila gasa, is used to refer to abnormally gluttonous eating, without regard to etiquette or appropriate quantities consumed, and where one mindlessly follows his craving. Now, the legal meaning of this term is eating despite being full, despite being fully satiated. So this kind of eating is not done out of a normal desire for food, but rather with effort. And it is an unpleasant experience. So with regard to certain Jewish laws, certain halachas, consuming food in this manner is not considered eating. Now, we know, for example, that when you eat a meal, right? What is the definition of a meal, an actual meal? A meal means that after the meal is over, you say the grace after the meal. So even if you eat a lot of food, but you don't eat bread with it, then it's not a meal. Then it's considered a snack. You'll say a blessing before you eat, and you'll say a modified, shortened blessing afterward, depending on what you eat. If you eat, for example, a croissant, which seems like bread, but is not actually bread, so then you would say, Borei Minei Mizonos is the blessing before, and afterwards you would say the blessing after eating a snack. If you don't even have that kind, no wheat products, you'll probably say something like Borei Nefashos, blesses the Lord who creates the creatures and their needs. But if you eat bread, then you have to wash your hands before, say a blessing over the bread. Then it is legally defined as a meal. And then after you finish, you say the whole grace after the meals. So this is legal definitions of different kinds of meals. Now what's fascinating here is somebody who eats way beyond when they're full, right? And I believe the comedian Louis C.K. Says a joke that a meal is not over when I'm full. A meal is over when I hate myself. So that's clearly excessive eating, which he's just mindlessly, following his urge to keep stuffing his face, even though afterward he feels bloated and disgusting. So he ate well beyond the point that he should have been eating. Now, legally, that kind of eating after you've had a normal meal, and then when you keep eating, that is not the legal definition of eating. And it matters because if a priest is commanded to eat a certain portion, of a sin offering that was brought by some individual, and the priest eating the portion of the sin offering that's eaten by the priest is part of that atonement process of the individual who brings it. But if the priest is already totally full before he eats, then when he eats that portion of the sin offering, it's as if he didn't eat, because excessive eating is not eating. And conversely, interesting also, if you're so famished that you're just starving, and again, it's not kind of normal eating, then that's problematic also. And so if a priest only had a very small amount of the sacrificial, a lamb, let's say, or a goat that was brought as an offering, as a sin offering, and there's just very little of that flesh to give to the priest, then they'll also have a little bit of a meal, some other food, maybe some teruma, some bread, etc. And then, they're not fully famished, but they're eating that part of the sacrificial offering along with some kind of normal amount of food, and that makes it a satisfying and proper meal. Now, Rav Sheshes says if a priest of the priestly watch was tamei, ritually impure, then with regard to a communal offering, right, brought on behalf of the Jewish community, the Jewish people, so if a priest of the priestly watch was ritually impure, then with regard to a communal offering, he gives it to any priest he wishes, right, the part that would have fallen to him, so he can give it to any priest that he wishes, and the performance of its service and its hide are given to the members of the priestly watch, right? These are the priestly gifts of these communal offerings. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances where this law applies? If there are ritually pure priests that are available, right, priests that are tahor, then can impure ones perform the temple service and by extension appoint an agent to perform it in their stead? And if there are no ritually pure priests, right, if for some reason all of the priests that were available in Jerusalem, certainly all the ones serving the temple in a priestly watch, had become tamei for whatever reason. So then what? Does the temple just stop and no communal offerings are brought? No. If all of the priests are impure, then they will bring it. If any priests are available who are pure and just the majority are impure, okay, we'll find the pure priests and they can bring the offerings. But if there are no pure priests available, again, ritually pure or ritually impure, if there are no ritually pure priests available, then an impure priest can bring the offering, but he won't be able to eat the portions that are normally given to the priests. So if there are no ritually pure priests there, as all the members of the priestly watch are impure, is the performance of its service and its hide given to the members of the priestly watch? Even though communal offerings are sacrificed in such a circumstance, the priests are impure and are not able to eat the offering, even though they may sacrifice it so that the communal offerings are being brought, despite all of the priests in that priestly watch being in a state of tumah, ritual impurity. So Rava said in explanation of this, say that they are given, the priestly portions are given to blemished, the offerings are given to blemished but ritually pure priests who are on that priestly watch. Even though blemished priests are disqualified from performing the temple service and therefore the offering must be sacrificed by impure priests, the blemished priests are permitted to eat the portions of the sacrificial offerings designated for priests, since they are ritually pure. They can't bring it on the altar because they're blemished, but they can eat it because they're in a state of tahara, ritual purity. Rav Ashi says, if a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, was an oinein, meaning an acute mourner, that a close member of his family had died that day, but had yet to be buried, right? The close relative had just died but had not yet been buried. So this is called being an acute mourner. So if the high priest is an acute mourner and he had an offering to sacrifice on his own behalf, so he gives the offering to any priest that he wishes to sacrifice it, and the performance of its service and its hide are given to the members of the priestly watch. And the Gemara asks, what is Rav Ashi's statement teaching us? We already learned in a Baraisa in Tractate Zevachim that a high priest may sacrifice an offering even when he is an acute mourner, but he does not eat it during the day while he is an acute mourner, and he does not receive a portion of the sacrifice to eat at night after his acute mourning is finished. So it follows from this Baraisa that since he sacrifices it by himself, he is able to appoint another priest in his stead, and since he may not eat it, it is given to the priestly watch to eat. So what then was the novelty of Rav Ashi's statement? And the Gemara answers, it might enter your mind to say that when the merciful one had compassion on the high priest, permitting him to continue serving in the temple even while in a state of acute mourning, it was for him to sacrifice. But with regard to appointing an agent, he is not able to appoint one. Therefore, Rav Ashi teaches us that he is able to appoint an agent since he himself is permitted to perform the temple service. Okay. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 9. Here is Mishnah number 7. With regard to one who robs a convert and takes a false oath, denying having done so, and then the convert dies. So the robber, in order to achieve repentance, pays the principal, i.e. the stolen item, or if it is no longer extant, its monetary value, plus the additional 1/5 of its value to the priest, right? We even discussed this earlier today. Since the convert died and left no heirs, there's no estate or heirs to make this restitution to. So instead, it's given to the priests. And after he pays that principal, right, what he robbed, and then swore he hadn't robbed, and then he admits that he both robbed and swore falsely. So now, since he can't make restitution to the convert because he died, and he can't make restitution to the robbery victim's heirs because he didn't have any, so he gives it to the priests. And so after he pays the principal of what he stole plus the 5th, which is a penalty, Then he brings a guilt offering to the altar, as it is stated, Numbers 5:8. But if the man has no kinsman to whom restitution may be made for the guilt, the restitution for guilt that is made shall be the Lord's, even the priest's, besides the ram of the atonement, whereby atonement shall be made for him. So now the Mishnah continues. If the robber was bringing the money and the guilt offering up to Jerusalem and he died before paying the priests and bringing his offering, the money shall be given to the robber's children, and the animal designated for the guilt offering shall graze until it becomes blemished and consequently disqualified from being sacrificed. And the animal shall then be sold, and the money received for it shall be allocated for communal gift offerings. If the robber gave the money to the members of the priestly watch, and then he died before they sacrificed his guilt offering, then the robber's heirs, his heirs, right, cannot remove the money from the priest's possession. As it is stated, and every man's hallowed things shall be his. Whatsoever any man gives to the priest, it shall be his. Numbers 5:10. So now the Mishnah continues. If the robber gave the money to the priestly watch of Yoyarib, right? And then they gave the guilt offering to the priestly watch of Yediah. So Yoyarib and Yediah are the names of two of these 24 priestly watches. And the reason that these two are chosen to be the example is because they're the first two, right? The priestly watches were on a schedule in sequence, like I said, they would serve for about a week, for 1 week every 6 months. And so Yoyarib and Yediah were the first two in that order. And so if the robber gave the money to the priestly watch of Yoyarib, and then he gave the guilt offering to the priestly watch of Yediah, right? So he gave the restitution, let's say, to the priests who were serving, and they would change after every Shabbos, right? So, right, I think after Shabbos or before Shabbos, I think after Shabbos they would change the priestly watch. I can't remember when they would do the changeover. Maybe it was right before Shabbos, so both of them are there on Shabbos. I can't remember. So at any rate, he gave the restitution to one group of priests, and then he gave his offering to be brought to complete his atonement to a different group of priests. So that's the issue, because the watch had changed at the temple. So if the robber gave the money to the watch of Yoyarib, and then he gave the guilt offering to the priestly watch of Yediah, which was the following priestly watch, and he gave it to them to sacrifice on his behalf, so he has fulfilled his obligation. By contrast, if he first gave the guilt offering to the priestly watch of Yoyarib, and then he gave the money to the priestly watch of Yediah, if the animal designated for the guilt offering is extant, then members of the priestly watch of Yediah who received the money should sacrifice that animal. But if it is no longer extant because the priestly watch of Yoyarib had already sacrificed it, he should return and bring another guilt offering. For one who brings his stolen item to the priests, before he brings his guilt offering, he has fulfilled his obligation to make his atonement. But one who brings his guilt offering before he brings his stolen item has not fulfilled his obligation, right? So remember, this is the case. A robber steals, swears that he didn't steal, and then comes clean and admits that yes, he stole and he swore falsely. So he has to make restitution, and he has to add the fifth, and he has to bring the guilt offering. And what we're learning here is he has to make the restitution and pay the penalty before he brings the guilt offering. If he brings the guilt offering before making restitution, it's as if he didn't do anything. He's going to have to bring another guilt offering afterward. Although he cannot sacrifice the offering before paying the principal, if he gave the principal but did not yet give the additional 1/5 payment, the lack of having given the additional 1/5 payment does not preclude sacrificing the offering. So he could make restitution of the principal and then bring the offering and then pay the fifth. That's okay. The ideal way is make restitution, pay the fifth, and then bring the guilt offering. But if he brings the guilt offering before paying back the principal, he's going to have to bring another guilt offering. That is the Mishna. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in explanation of the verses cited in our Mishnah. But if the man has no kinsman, the restitution for guilt that is made shall be the Lord's, even the priest's. Well, with regard to the word guilt, this is referring to the principal, i.e. the stolen item itself or its equivalent value. The restitution that is made, this is referring to the 1/5 additional penalty. Or perhaps this is not the proper interpretation of the verse. Rather, it should be interpreted guilt. This is referring to the ram of the guilt offering. So before continuing the Baraisa, the Gemara interrupts to clarify. And for what purpose does the Baraisa distinguish between the two interpretations of guilt? As in any event, both the principal and the guilt offering must be brought in order to complete the atonement. So the Gemara explains this is to exclude that which Rava holds. As Rava says, with regard to the stolen item of a convert, that the robber returned at night, the robber did not fulfill his obligation. And similarly, if he returned it to him in halves, he did not fulfill his obligation. What is the reason? The merciful one labeled the stolen item with the word guilt, teaching that just as a guilt offering cannot be offered at night, offerings were only brought during the day in the temple, nor in halves. You can't bring 2 halves of an offering. You have to bring it all at once. So too, the stolen item cannot be returned neither at night nor in halves. So the Baraisa continues, that's according to Rava, right? Minority opinion. So the Baraisa continues, when it says in that verse, besides the ram of the atonement, referring to the offering, the guilt offering that accompanies this restitution plus penalty in order for this robber who swore a false oath to complete his atonement. When it says in the verse, besides the ram of atonement, referring to the offering, you must say concerning the word guilt written earlier in the verse that this is referring to the principal, the restitution of what was stolen or its value. It is taught in another Baraisa that with regard to the word guilt, this is referring to the principal. The restitution that is made, this is referring to the additional 5th. Or perhaps that is not the proper interpretation. Rather, it should be interpreted guilt. This is referring to the additional 5th. And before continuing the Baraisa, the Gemara interrupts again to clarify for what purpose does the Baraisa distinguish between the two interpretations. And the Gemara explains to exclude that which the Mishna teaches. As we learned in the Mishnah, if he gave him the principal but did not yet give him the additional 1/5 payment, the lacking of having given the additional 5th does not preclude sacrificing the guilt offering. If guilt is referring to the additional 1/5, then, on the contrary, it would follow that the lack of having given the additional 5th precludes sacrificing the offering. So the Baraisa continues, when it says in the previous verse, and he shall make restitution for his guilt in full, add unto it the 5th part thereof, Numbers 5:7, you must say concerning the word guilt that this is referring to the principal. It is taught in another Baraisa with regard to the word guilt. This is referring to the principal. The restitution that is made, this is referring to the additional 5th. And the verse is speaking of robbery of a convert. Or perhaps this is not the proper interpretation of the verse. Rather, it should be interpreted the restitution that is made. This is referring to the double payment that a thief must pay. And the verse is speaking of a theft from a convert. And when it says in the previous verse, and he shall make restitution for his guilt in full, and add onto it the 5th part thereof, the verse is speaking of money that is paid exactly according to the principle and not double payment. Now, having quoted Rava's statement, the Gemara returns to discuss the matter itself. Rava says, with regard to the stolen item of a convert, that the robber returned at night. The robber did not fulfill his obligation. And similarly, if he returned it to him in halves, he did not fulfill his obligation. What is the reason? Because the merciful one labeled the stolen item with the term guilt, teaching that just as a guilt offering cannot be offered at night or in halves, so too the stolen item cannot be returned at night or in halves. And Rava says, with regard to the stolen item of a convert that does not have the value of 1 peruta, the smallest coin there was, for each and every priest on the priestly watch, right? So with regard to the stolen item of a convert that does not have the value of 1 peruta, for each and every priest on the priestly watch, the robber did not fulfill his obligation by giving it to the priestly watch. And what is the reason? As it is written, the restitution for guilt that is made. Meaning that the robber has not fulfilled his obligation to return the stolen item until there will be halakhically significant restitution made to each and every priest, minimally 1 peruta. If the stolen item was of less value than can be distributed with each priest in the watch receiving at least 1 peruta, then the robber must add to the payment so that each priest receives 1 peruta. This is not asking for so much. A peruta is like a penny. So if there were, 30 priests serving in the temple during this one watch for that week, okay, so you have to bring at least 30 pennies with you so that each priest gets a halakhically significant amount of that restitution that is made. Again, it's only being given to the priest because the one that he stole from has died and left no heirs. Now, based on this law, Rava raises a dilemma. If the stolen item does not have the value of 1 peruta for each priest, on the priestly watch of Uriah, which had many priests, but it has the value of 1 peruta for each priest on the priestly watch of Yediah, which had fewer priests, then what is the law? Now we're on page 110b. So the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances with regard to which Rava raises his dilemma? If we say that the dilemma is raised in a case where he gave the money to the priestly watch of Yediah during the time of the temple service of the priestly watch of Yediah, well then there's no dilemma. So there is in this payment enough value for each priest to receive 1 peruta. So no, the Gemara explains, it is still necessary to raise the dilemma in a case where he gave it to the Yediah priestly watch during the time of the temple service of the priestly watch of Uriah. In that case, what is the law? And the Gemara explains the 2 possibilities. Do we say that since it is not during Yediah's priestly watch, it is nothing, i.e. it is not a fulfillment of the mitzvah to return the stolen item because you're supposed to give it to the members of the priestly watch that is serving in the temple at the time you bring this restitution. You can't designate it for next week's priestly watch. You give it to the priests that are there then. Or perhaps we say that since it was not fit for the Uriah priestly watch, as it was insufficient value, from the outset it stands ready for the Yediah priestly watch, and by giving it to them, he fulfilled the mitzvah. And the Gemara comments, Taiku, this question shall stand unresolved. Again, one of those examples where they're asking the question and the dilemma to test their understanding of the law. Because obviously it's a non-issue if you just add a few pennies to what's being brought. But that doesn't mean that it's not an interesting halakhic question. And by interesting, remember, it's not that these guys are, legal scholars who love debating legal questions because it's fun for them. I mean, it was, but that's not the reason they do it. And that's not the reason we do it, right? Because any Torah that we study, anytime we seek to understand God's will through God's laws, as written in the Torah, whether the written Torah or the oral Torah, we are engaged in Torah study. We are engaged in trying to understand God's will. And that is a major mitzvah in itself, right? So it said, any law is an important law to study, even if it seems, less personally relevant to our lives. It's no less relevant for the mitzvah of Torah study. Now, Rava raises another dilemma with regard to priests. What is the law concerning whether they may divide among themselves the restitution for robbery of a convert, with some priests taking a larger share in exchange for taking a smaller share in the restitution of the robbery of a convert? In other words, can the priests arrange that one priest or several priests will receive the restitution for one robbery, and another priest or several priests will receive the restitution for a different robbery another time? Or does any restitution that comes in for one of these cases where the victim died and didn't leave any heirs, that the restitution that's made to the priestly watch has to be divided among all the members of the watch? Or can they just say, okay, we'll divide, whoever happens to be in the room at the time, we'll take this one, and the guys who are outside working right now bringing offerings, they'll take the next one. Can they do that? So Rav explains the two possibilities. Do we say that the merciful one labeled a stolen item with the term guilt, and therefore just as with a guilt offering, the priests may not divide portions of a guilt offering, with some priests taking a larger share in exchange for taking a smaller share in other portions of a guilt offering, but rather all priests of the watch share in the sacrificial flesh? So too with the restitution for robbery. The priest may not divide the restitution for this robbery of a convert who left no heirs, with some priests taking a larger share in exchange for others taking a smaller share of another robbery of a convert when it comes in. Or perhaps the restitution for robbery of a convert who left no heirs that is paid to the priests is not in fact an offering, but rather it is monetary restitution. And monetary restitution may be divided in this manner among the priests. And so Rava then resolves his dilemma himself. The merciful one labeled the stolen item with the term guilt, so it may not be divided in this manner. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, teaches it explicitly as a ruling and not as a dilemma and a solution. That Rava says, priests may not divide the restitution for robbery of a convert who died leaving no heirs, with some priests taking a larger share in exchange for taking a smaller share in the next restitution of robbery. And what is the reason? Because the merciful one labeled the stolen item with the term guilt, therefore tying its law to the law of guilt offerings brought on the altar, and a portion of that flesh being distributed among the priests, and it had to be distributed to all of them equally who were serving on that priestly watch. Next subject. Rava raises a dilemma. What is the status of priests with regard to the restitution for robbery of a convert who died leaving no heirs? Are they considered heirs of the convert, or are they recipients of gifts? What difference does it make? Let's find out. The Gemara asks immediately, what's the nafkamina, right? What is the practical difference? And the Gemara answers, the difference would be in a case where one robbed a convert of leavened bread, and then Passover elapsed over it, rendering it an item from which a Jew is prohibited to derive benefit and therefore valueless. So if you say that the priests are heirs, this is what they inherit, only that which the robber bequeaths to them, and the priests receive the valueless leavened bread as is. And if you say that they are recipients of gifts, well, then it is a gift that the merciful one is saying that the robber should give to them, and this robber is not giving them anything, for it is merely dust. Therefore, the robber should have to pay the priests what the value of the bread had been at the time of the robbery, right? And we've learned this before, that if a robber steals chametz, leavened bread, a Jewish robber steals leavened bread from another Jew, and then while it's in the possession of the robber, Passover comes, right? And so that bread became nullified for benefit, right? Because it was chametz in the possession of a Jew during Passover, it now becomes prohibited for eating even after Passover is over. You can't eat it afterwards because a Jew owned it during Passover. Now, if the robber wants to make restitution to the guy he stole it from, it's a surprise in the law that he can return that bread, because the thing that he stole, he's giving it back. And he says, that which is yours is before you. The victim cannot eat that chametz. It's prohibited for any Jew to eat bread that was in the possession of a Jew during Passover. So the robbery victim receives that bread, but he can't do anything with it. It just gets thrown out. But what's interesting is that if the bread disappeared, if it was lost, then the robber, in order to make restitution, has to pay the monetary value of what the chametz was worth at the time that he stole it, which was before Passover. So if it's lost, the robbery victim gets money. If it still exists, the robbery victim receives something worthless if the robber seeks to make that restitution. Okay. Now, Rav Zera raises the dilemma like this. Even if you say that they are recipients of gifts, this question, i.e. whether a robber of leavened bread over which Passover then elapsed, fulfills the mitzvah to return the stolen item, even in this devalued state, this is not our dilemma, as this is certainly a fulfillment of the obligation. For this stolen item is the gift with regard to which the merciful one states in the Torah that the robber should give it to the priests. In other words, the robber, if he was going to make restitution to the robbery victim, he could give that bread back. Now that the victim is dead and left no heirs, it has to go to the priests. Well, the thing that he would be restoring to the victim, now he's going to give it to the priest. So even though it's worthless, he can give it to the priest, according to Rav Zera. But rather, when we have a dilemma, whether the priests are considered as heirs or recipients of gifts, the practical difference arises in the case where 10 animals came into the priest's possession for payment of robbery of a convert. And the dilemma is, are they obligated to separate tithe from them or not? Fascinating. So somebody stole, now it's a much, much bigger theft, right? He stole 10 animals from this person who then died and left no heirs. So you have to make, if you're going to make restitution to make an atonement, you give it to the priests. Okay, so because the robbery victim left no heirs, it goes to the priests instead. So when they receive these 10 animals, are they receiving them as the heirs of the robbery victim who died without heirs? Or are they receiving them as gifts from the Holy One who mandated that when restitution can't be made to a robbery victim, it goes instead to the priests? And the nafka mina, the practical difference, involves now the question, 10 animals were given, do the recipients, these priests, have to tithe one of the 10 animals? So the Gemara explains the two possibilities. Perhaps the priests are the heirs of the robbery victim, in which case they will be obligated to tithe. For the master said in a Mishna, Tractate Bechoros, 56b, that if heirs acquired animals in the jointly held property of the estate, i.e. the heirs jointly own the animals as the inheritance had yet to be divided, they are obligated to separate tithes from the animals born to those animals, and the same will apply to the priests. Or perhaps the priests are recipients of gifts. And we learned in a Mishna in Tractate Bechoros that one who purchases an animal or one who has an animal given to him as a gift is exempt from the obligation to separate the animal tithe, and the same will apply to the priests. So what is the law in this case? And the Gemara answers, come in here, a resolution to this dilemma from a Baraisa, Tractate Chala. 24 priestly gifts were given to Aaron and to his sons, right? In other words, all priests, the Kohanim, are the descendants of Moses' brother Aaron and his sons. So, meaning 24 priestly gifts were given to the priests of Israel. And all of them, all 24, were given with a derivation from a generalization and a detail and a generalization, and with a covenant of salt. The verses in the book of Numbers, chapter 18, detail the gifts of the priesthood. So the first verse, 18:8, Numbers 18:8, is written in general terms, followed by verses listing the actual gifts in verses 9 through 18, followed by a final verse written in general terms. So the method of interpreting verses written in this manner is one of the 13 hermeneutical principles. So additionally, the phrase covenant of salt is written in the final verse in 18:19 and is referring to all of the gifts of the priesthood. So what do we learn from the way that these gifts are described in the Torah? This serves to teach that anyone who fulfills the mitzvah of giving the gifts of the priesthood is considered as if he fulfills the entire Torah, which is interpreted using the principle of a generalization and a detail and a generalization, and as if he has brought all of the offerings concerning which there is a covenant of salt. And anyone who violates the mitzvah of giving the gifts of the priesthood is considered as if he violates the entire Torah, which is interpreted using the principle of generalization, detail, generalization, and as if he has not brought all the offerings concerning which there is a covenant of salt. So the Bryce explains, and these are the 24 gifts, meaning categories of gifts that priests were entitled to. Now remember that when the promised land was divided up among the tribes of Israel, all of the tribes except Levi received portions of land. The tribe of Levi did not, right? They didn't receive farms and fields. They got houses in the cities. And they would end up being, the accountants and lawyers and singers and performers and those who serve in the temple. The Kohanim, the priests, are a subset of the Levium. But the Levium would also serve in the temple as the gatekeepers and the singers in the holy temple. And the Levium and the Kohanim would receive a tithe from the rest of the people in return for their avoda, their service to God and service in the temple. So when we talk about these gifts, now the priestly gifts are only to the Kohanim, not to the Levium. The Levium would get the Meiser, right, the tenth. The Kohanim would get the first 2%, which is the teruma. But the Levium would also have to tithe to the Kohanim. Okay, so this system depends on people acting piously and giving what they're supposed to give. Now, the Kohanim are entitled to these 24 gifts. So what are they? And these are the 24 gifts. There are 10 in the temple, and 4 in Jerusalem, and 10 in the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel. The 10 gifts that the priests consume only in the temple are the flesh of an animal sin offering, as opposed to a meal offering, and a bird sin offering, and a definite guilt offering, and a provisional guilt offering, and a communal peace offerings, i.e. the lambs offered on Shavuos, and the log of oil that accompanies the guilt offering of a recovered mitzorah, one who had the skin condition saras and is bringing offerings at the end of his condition, of his purification, and the surplus of the omer, i.e. what remains of the measure of barley brought as a communal offering on the 16th of Nisan, and the 2 loaves, i.e. the public offerings of 2 loaves from the new wheat offered on the festival of Shavuos, and the showbread, right, the breads that were sat on the table in the sanctuary, in the temple, for a week at a time, and then on Shabbos they'd be changed, or right before Shabbos they'd be changed over, and then the priest would eat the bread that came off the table, and it was one of the miracles of the temple that it was as fresh after a week of sitting on the table of the showbreads as it was when it was placed there. And the 2 loaves, and the showbread, and the leftovers of grain offerings after the priests have offered the required handful. Now, these priestly offerings, we're not talking about big ticket items. It's holy, it's beautiful, it's something only priests receive, but what we're talking about is like little morsels of the sacrificial offerings, little morsels of the showbreads or the 2 loaves, etc. It was a mark of esteem that, sort of God apportioned to them, that they would be able to participate in Israel bringing its offerings, and they would receive some more valuable things like the hides of certain offerings, and then the terum and tithes outside of the temple, as we'll see. Right, but a lot of this, is sort of in terms of actual financial value, it's more honorific, right? Now the Brisa continues, and the 4 gifts that the priests consume anywhere in Jerusalem, this is the Bechor, the firstborn of kosher animals, and the first fruits that are brought each season, and the portions separated for the priests from the thanks offerings, and the ram of a Nazir, one who took a vow to abstain from products of the grapevine. At the conclusion of his Naziris, certain offerings would be brought, and part of that would go to the priests. I am almost done, so if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Baraisa continues. Hold on. There we go. And the Baraisa continues, and 10 gifts that the priests consume anywhere in the boundaries of the land of Israel. These are teruma, i.e. the portion of the produce designated for the priest, the first 2% of the harvest of the fields in the land of Israel, and the teruma of the tithe. This is when a Levite would receive the 10th, and then he would take out a 10th of that and give it to the priests. And the challah, when women are making bread, or when anyone is making enough bread, if they make it in sufficient quantity, a portion is taken away from that. That's called the challah, and that was given to the priests. Nowadays, we call an egg bread that we eat on Friday nights challah, but that's actually a vestigial label from the idea that when bread was made in sufficient quantities so that the challah offering could be taken, that was the challah. But now when women make, about 5 pounds of flour, then it's enough bread being made at once that they will separate a portion of the dough. They can't give it to a priest since the temple is not standing anymore, so they just put it aside, and then it gets usually burned along with the chametz, on the eve of Passover. So that's the challah gift, which was given to priests, and the first of the sheared wool that shepherds would take, and the gifts of non-sacrificial slaughtered animals, namely the right foreleg, the cheeks, and the maw, which was the sacrificial portion, the portion of sacrificial offerings designated for priests. And a sheep or a goat given as redemption of the firstborn donkey, and a consecrated ancestral field that the priests receive in the Jubilee year, and a dedicated field, and payment for robbery of a convert who died without heirs. And the Gemara infers from the wording of the Baraisa, and this Baraisa, in any event, labels the payment for robbery of a convert a gift. And so the Gemara conclude from this Baraisa that the priests who receive this, gift that's designated for priests because the convert died without heirs, who was a robbery victim, that they are considered the recipients of gifts and not the inheritors of the one who died without heirs. And the Gemara affirms, indeed, conclude from it that this is so. And that concludes our discussion of Daf 110 here in Tractate Bava Kamma. And tomorrow, God willing, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll pick it up with page 111. I'm just seeing one question from Joe Branson. Is there a standard format or understood policy to make rulings today to address new issues? I have read that there are 3 different rabbis who have taught 3 different findings regarding cultured meat, and one teaches it can't be eaten as it has not been slaughtered properly, and another finds that it is not truly meat as it is started with eggs, and the third says it's okay to eat and should be considered to be parve as eggs are parve. Exactly. So what we don't have today is a Sanhedrin that would make an official ruling on behalf of the Jewish people. So how do we make rulings when there are new questions like this, right? Lab-grown meat. So are we going to say this is kosher? Like you said, one view is it can't be kosher because it wasn't an animal that was shechted, that was slaughtered in a kosher manner. And a different view is didn't need to be shechted because it was originally taken from kosher meat, and it's like making the kosher meat go farther. And another one says it's not even meat at all because it's sort of like eggs that are parve. So what are we to do? So this is why you have to have a Rav, right? Meaning your rabbi, right? Your Orthodox rabbi who is the one you go to ask these questions. And so, different communities will have their own Rav. And what ends up happening is that in any generation, there are the Gedolim, right? The Gadol of the door, right? The Gadol Hador, the great ones of the generation. Moshe Feinstein was definitely the Gadol of the generation until he passed away. I don't know when that was, maybe 20 years ago. In America, and he wasn't like the chief rabbi of America because there's no such thing, but he was considered so learned and so sort of head and shoulders above almost anyone else that his rulings were accepted by all different communities, even Hasidic communities and Ashkenaz communities and Sephardic communities. But there's always going to be communities that don't accept the rulings of a gadol in another community. But over time, sort of consensus sort of begins to emerge on certain questions, and other questions kind of remain divided, right? And so you have that at Passover, Ashkenaz, Jews in the Ashkenazic tradition, Northern Europe, will not eat kitnios, right? Like certain legumes or rice. And Sephardic Jews will eat those things during Passover. And it's because it was kind of there was a ruling in Northern Europe that you couldn't eat those foods, even though there's nothing about them that's inherently prohibited during Passover, but they would often be transported to market in burlap sacks where wheat had also been transported on other occasions, and there would be some chametz, some wheat mixed in with those products, and so they became prohibited during Passover. Now we live in a time where there is no mixing, right? When you buy chickpeas, they've only been together with other chickpeas and maybe touched, the metal containers or plastic containers, but they never came into contact with wheat. So nevertheless, that tradition over the centuries acquired the force of law. And we don't undermine laws that through tradition have acquired the force of law. And there's so much subtlety and nuance to these kinds of questions. This is why you have to have a Rav, right? And even as far back as Pirkei Avos, we're taught in the chapters of the fathers by our sages that you must have a Rav. You must acquire for yourself. You must have a Rav and acquire a friend, right? Both. So you have to have a Rav in your life to ask questions. And it's for that reason. So I'm sure that's an incomplete answer, but hopefully it sheds a little bit of light on your question, Joe. And that's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday at the regular time.